To be with us here in the building as we continue our study of 1 Corinthians, and we're going to be in chapter 11 here. Kind of set the groundwork for that last week, but want to come back and look more in the details of that particular text. It's a challenging passage, maybe not so much now as maybe it once was in relationship to discussions that folks have had over the years as it relates to the topic of head coverings, but we want to discuss it as best we can tonight as it relates to this particular chapter. And we'll get back into that study in just a moment. And so thank you all that are here being with us. Those of you at home, thank you as well. Before we begin, let's go to God in prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for a beautiful day that you've provided, an opportunity tonight to come together to study your word, to appreciate the testimony that you've provided for us. We're thankful for men like the Apostle Paul who records your message, allowing us to understand and know how it is that you would have us to live and conduct ourselves as believers, as part of the body of Christ, and as the church as a whole. And we're just thankful for that message. We're thankful for the ability to read and study and understand it. And again, just strengthen us as we learn more from your word this evening. And we pray this through Christ's name. Amen. So last week I gave you just some background thoughts, some things that I thought were important as it relates to understanding this particular narrative. There were a couple of things that just refresh your memory about that we talked about last week. Number one, remember that he says in verse 2, and let me just back it up on the screen for you for a moment, but he said in verse 2 as he begins this conversation, now I what? Now I praise you. What's he do in verse 13? If that's the right, I didn't go far enough. In verse 17, I apologize. He says, I praise you not. And I think sometimes we miss that. And I think there's a connector here. I think there is a conversation here in some ways that Paul was talking about where he uses one illustration about something he's praising them in, and the next illustration he's talking about something he's not praising them in. And there's a contrast being made as it relates to that. It's interesting if you back up, he talked about the fact that he praised them for keeping what? What's the word used? Okay, so the word in the King James it says ordinances. That's what's up here. We talked last week about the fact that this is the only time of the 14 times this Greek word is used, this is the only time ordinances is used. The other 13 times in the New Testament, the word tradition is used in relationship to translation. Not sure why that is, why the scholars chose to do that, but that's just kind of the reality as it relates at least to this moment. That doesn't really change the thought here, though. And the idea is that Paul had brought ordinances, guidance, traditional things that the apostles had shared with them, whatever you want to kind of view that as, but he had delivered them to them, and they had been honoring those things, and he's bringing them some praise as it relates to it. Now, as the conversation continues over the next several verses, it's obvious there is some challenge over this issue and how it is they should address the difficulty of those who are praying and prophesying. And at that particular time, there are both men and women who are doing that. Now, we talked last week about the fact that I believe the context of praying or prophesying implies to me, especially when you fast forward in the letter to chapter 13, when he addresses the challenges of spiritual gifts and that they were there being used at that particular time, but they were going to eventually go away, and you move into chapter 14, you see that conversation. There's a need for us to, I believe, understand that I believe Paul's talking about spiritually gifted praying and prophesying here. Not just the act of praying or prophesying of any type or kind. I think he's got a mindset here that he's dealing with. I think that can be evidenced by looking at a couple of different things. If you look at a couple of contexts with me this evening, just to illustrate it to you, look at Acts chapter 21 and in verse 19. I'll show it to you on the screen as well. But the prophet Joel in Joel chapter 2 and verse 21 had said that that there was a day coming when their sons and their daughters would prophesy. You see that talked about again and referenced in Acts chapter 2 and verse 17. And then I brought you to Acts 21 and verse 9 just to remind you that here's a literal case of that actually happening. Here was a man, an evangelist, by the name of Philip in verse 8, who has simply said the same man had 4 daughters, virgins, which did prophesy. And so they're living in a time period when the New Testament is being written where there are still spiritual, miraculous gifts occurring, and there were both men and women involved in performing, if you will, those spiritual, miraculous gifts. Now, for tonight, our study isn't about spiritual miraculous gifts and how did they get those gifts. We could talk about that. We could briefly talk about how that the apostles had the ability to share those and pass that on. We see evidences within Scripture where those who had even had spiritual gifts said, I can't pass it on, right? But I will call for the apostles to come, and that's a conversation for another time. But just simply understand that those spiritual gifts were still occurring in that day. And there's a need then, if the same kind of activities are being performed spiritually, and you go back to that earlier conversation in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 about those relationships that occurred, where he said every head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is man, the head of Christ is God. That's all relationship that he's speaking about there and how those connectivities work. Because of that, every man praying or prophesying, which I believe is spiritually gifted praying and prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoreth his head. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoreth her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. So there's these ordinances, traditions, customs that are happening in their day where it was traditional for a woman to be veiled, to be covered. If we're going to talk about the kind of covering, they were covered. Now, these were not just small objects of covering portions. They were head coverings that they were wearing traditionally at that particular time. So let me ask this question, though. Understanding the relationship that he just spoke of, man to woman, Christ to man, Christ to God. So in what way do you think it would be a dishonor for a man to pray or prophesy with his head covered, but it would be a dishonor in the reverse for a woman? Is there any kind of inclination as to why you might think that would be? Why one and not the other? Is it strictly tradition and custom? Men didn't wear the coverings, and the women did. I suppose we could argue that. And I'm just asking because I think sometimes we have a discussion about whether she should or shouldn't wear the covering, right? Should she or should she not be wearing a covering? Should you, all the ladies sitting here right now, should you or should you not be wearing a covering is ultimately where the question often leads. And we sometimes have that conversation without ever really discussing, well, what's Paul talking about here? Okay, so he's got order of leadership. That he placed man over woman in terms of leadership. He has placed Christ over man. And in some senses, in the same fashion, the Father is over the Son. And so there's order of relationship and leadership here. So again, so why might it be a dishonor for man to cover? And maybe I'm making more of this than I should. I'm trying to grasp. When I study this, I'm trying to understand not just what's happening and why it might be happening, because of these spiritual praying process, but why is it a dishonor for one and not the other? And is it strictly because of custom? Okay, so there was a sense of fidelity she would be demonstrating by maintaining the covering in that culture. So that won't. Okay, so she, by wearing the covering within that culture, it was a sign that she understood her relationship to man that God had designed.
I'm just simply looking at verse 7. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, for as much he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. So if he's covering the image of God, basically.
Okay, and that's, thank you, because that's kind of where my mind went for a little bit in this. You in the order in which they came, right? God creates man. Who was with God, by the way, when he created man? Christ was, right? And so God creates man, then God takes part of man and creates woman, and that order of things, relationship to each other, has been in existence then from the very beginning of that process. So if there's any imagery here at all, and again, I'm more asking than I'm telling it, just food for thought. If there's imagery here, if man covers his head, he just covered whom? Christ in the text. But when the woman covers her head, who does she cover? She covers man. You see that? She covers man, the one in relationship that's above her. If he were to do it, he covers Christ in the imagery. Yeah. And that's the only thing I could, and why I even bring it up, is it was the only thing that I could seem to come to an understanding about as it relates to the why. Why is it significant? And I suppose, and by the way, I'm okay in some senses with the idea that because it was cultural, because it was the way society worked in that day, and if she was going to be able to demonstrate her respect in the relationship to man, she should wear the covering. I'm okay with that, that simple conclusion. But it just seemed to have greater imagery than that to me when I looked at this. But be that as it may, end result is praying and prophesying in the Spirit, which, by the way, if that's an accurate description, can that even happen today? No, right? That's not the first thing in 1 Corinthians, by the way, that had specific meaning to them, right? Remember the present distress? The instructions Paul gave as it relates to who should get married and who shouldn't get married and who should remain unmarried and who shouldn't remain unmarried and all that conversation. And he gave them some advice that he gave the exact opposite advice to Timothy, right? He tells people in Corinth, if you end up a widow or a widow, you might just want to stay that way. But he told Timothy, when you go out and preach the places you're going, I want you to tell those widows that if they're young enough, they need to find a husband. Completely contrasting thoughts because of the circumstance that Corinth was in. My point, friends, is Corinth has got an interesting circumstance here they're addressing. And one of those circumstances is that you still have a time period in which people are praying and prophesying in the Spirit. How am I going to evidence that I have respect as a man for Christ? And how am I going to evidence that as a woman I have respect for the man? And Paul says the way we do that is a man prays and prophesies with his head uncovered, and a woman would pray or prophesy with her head covered, and that's how we're going to handle that. That's the tradition, that's the custom, that's the ordinance that would demonstrate that relationship. And Paul, in essence, says, I don't see any reason to negate that. I don't see any reason to step away from that. Thoughts or questions up to there? So because he's the image of the glory of God and the woman is the glory of man, that's why this should happen. Verse 8, for the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. That goes back to what? creation, right? Go back to Genesis. And so the relationship that we're speaking of here really, if you will, has what we might simply say its origins in Genesis, which Genesis, by the way, simply means beginning, right? In the beginning. And neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. Now, that's a great point, by the way, and there's no reason to be offended by that. Paul didn't say she's lesser a human being. He didn't say that makes her somehow and unequal in relationship to her connection to God and her ability to find salvation. None of that is what Paul's intent here is. He's just stating creational fact that God looked at his creation initially and said it is good, and then he took a second look, if you will, figuratively and literally, takes another look, and he sees man by himself, and he says, it is not good that man should be alone. I'll create him a helpmeet. Right? So woman was created for the purpose that when God looked down and saw his creation, he's in this line of history, he saw weakness, if you will, or he saw a flaw. That man was alone, and that wasn't good in the eyes of God, and so he creates woman for the perfect helpmeet to man. That's right. And she was created perfectly suited for them to be comparable through the wisdom of God. And so then he says, for this cause, because of this creative relationship, because the connectivity and relationship order is God, Christ, man, woman in this line of relationships, so she should have power on her head because of the angels. Somebody tell me what that phrase "because of the angels" mean, and I got $100 in my pocket for you. Yeah. The truth is, you would be wiser than any scholar I read. Every scholar I read from said, I don't know. Okay. And so that act could be viewed as, and so, but so who are these angels then? She ought to have power on her head because of the angels. Yeah. Okay. Now, I'm always cautious because God can use His beings in any form or fashion that He chooses to. But there are those who argue that the idea, if this context is about what's happening in moments of worship, and the belief of that particular writer was that there are angels observing that worship, and they observe her not respecting her head, you just did that in front of angels. And you know, one school of thought. I saw your eyes light up for a second ago. Go ahead, Bonnie.
If you look, I've looked at it. If you look at what he's saying, God, Christ, man, you know, as in humankind. In heaven, of course, there's God. There's the sons of God, and then there's the angels. And so, and of course, Christ was made a little lower than the angels when he became a man. So if you put them side by side and look at the comparison, then if you go God, sons of God, angels, and then you look at Christ, men, and then women, they fall in the same order.
Yeah. And so it may be a reference to order. And there are other texts that talk about how, and you referenced the one about Christ becoming just little lower than the angels when he became man. which would put them, angels, in between Christ. Between man and Christ, if it's still relationship. And that could very well be. Could very well be. Any other thoughts about these angels? And I think that's the aspect that probably is the simpler to understand, right? The idea that the covering in this praying and prophesying situation is a sign that she respects authority as it comes to that. We could talk all night, by the way, about what these angels mean. And here's why I bring it up in the way that I did. What you may say about that or what I may say about that may all have kind of plausible, seemingly reasonable explanations to why it's there. The challenge we have is simply this. Paul doesn't what? He doesn't further tell us. Paul doesn't give us any more detail, and I don't even know a text that I could go to and show some kind of specific connectivity to. Here's what I do know, though, that let me rephrase this. Here's what I believe with confidence. They understood it. I think sometimes we forget that there's a specific audience in mind when he writes this, and it wasn't us. We weren't the audience. We are the eventual audience. We are the eventual learners from what's being revealed here, but he's got an audience of people in mind that are sitting in Corinth in that time period. And it wouldn't be the first time that somebody, an apostle, wrote something that was far easier to understand in the time period in which it was written than we can grasp. The book of Revelation is filled with that very kind of thing. Things that they would have understood in the moment that are more difficult for us to understand later. I never have been able to come to any solid conclusion as to what these angels or what reference this makes, with the exception of maybe this order situation. Definitely the idea that she's showing her respect for authority. I can understand all those aspects. Why the reference to angels has always troubled me. And that's just an honest answer to that description. Anybody else got other things? Maybe you've read something I haven't read or seen or thought of something.
I remember, I think it's in 2 Peter where it talks about angels having railing accusations. So don't give them cause to give railing accusations to you.
Yeah.
The whole passage. It's a bunch of different things, but that's the only one that's really called.
Yeah. And so they're observant and don't give them an opportunity to bring this accusation. Anything else that you ran across or thought of? Nevertheless, then, great way to go into the next phrase, by the way. But nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. Paul does us a wonderful benefit there, right? Because what he just did was he helps us understand, listen, I'm not trying to tell you that one is better than the other, or that man is superior to woman, or vice versa. The truth is, they have always been meant from the time of creation to be, one. And meant to be together. Meant to be in harmony with one another. The man is, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man. And in what particular relationship? In the Lord. He or she is not any better a child of God than the other. Paul's, I believe, simply trying to illustrate this conversation has not been about, really in some ways, purely about authority and who has right to rule. This has always been about how can I demonstrate my respect for this relationship that I have to man when we're both fulfilling the same role and function. And the culture and society and the ordinances and traditions of that day were she would wear a covering to do that. Let me ask a question. How did a lot of the conversations that Paul writes to those in Corinth even begin? Because they had done what? They had asked questions that we are not what? We're not privy to. They had sent Paul a series of questions, concerns they had about various topics and subjects. We don't know what they said to him. We just know his responses. I think I could fairly conclude here that there's enough contention, if you will, or challenge. Should she wear the covering or not wear the covering? If we're both praying and prophesying, does she need to show that respect for the relationship, or can she take that off? Is there liberty? Remember, that's been a heavy conversation throughout the entire book of 1 Corinthians. Does she have liberty to remove herself from that custom and tradition now that she's part of Christ? Because after all, verse 11, nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. And again, I think sometimes we can get caught up in the detail and not really look at the bigger picture of why is Paul even having this conversation or addressing this subject. There were all kinds of issues in Corinth where they didn't know how to handle liberties. They didn't know how to handle their liberty when they went to the marketplace and whether that meat had been sacrificed to an idol or not. They didn't know how to handle their liberties in the present distress as to whether they were married or unmarried, and how to respond to the difficulties that unbelievers and believers might be having in marital relations. They didn't know how to exercise their liberties. Should I just walk away from this marriage because he's an unbeliever, or should I stay in it, Paul? Right? Think about the whole book. I think sometimes we make a mistake when we're studying the Scriptures, and we isolate. And it's okay to get into the details, but we isolate segments to the extent sometimes that we forget the greater framework in which it was written. There's been a large conversation going on about how do I exercise liberties without offending other issues. It appears to me that there were women who had decided that I'm free in Jesus. I don't need to wear this covering anymore. I don't need to wear a head covering anymore. Paul says, you may want to pause on that for a minute. If you're praying and prophesying in the Spirit, how's anybody going to know for sure whether you have respect for this relationship and this line? How we're going to be able to maintain that understanding in the situation that we're in? How do we use our liberties without causing difficulties with people wondering, well, does she really appreciate the relationship with her husband or other men? Or you see what I'm saying? There's a bigger picture here than just wear a covering or don't wear a covering. Do I have to or I don't have to? I think we've pushed this subject matter and even this text maybe into a world that it didn't really intend to be by the Apostle Paul. And that's just a conclusion that I, through my own study, as it relates to itself. Yeah. Is this going to become one more issue that the church in Corinth, who's got divisiveness over who baptized them, they've got divisiveness over who eats meat and who doesn't eat meat, and whether they went to the temple to get that or not. There's divisiveness all around, and Paul was trying to avert one more topic that they could become divisive over. And so he says to them, you understand the ordinances, the traditions that I've shared with you about this matter. And he even makes the statement in verse 13, judging yourselves, is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered? And Paul's just pleading to their own thought processes here. What do you think about that, Paul says? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him, but if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given for her for a covering? Now, the natural inclination sometimes for some is to come to verse 15 and say, well, see, she doesn't have to wear one because why? Her hair is one. I'm not saying that today she needs to wear a covering, but what I am concerned about is I don't know that that's Paul's intent here. Think about it again, and maybe this should have been one of the qualifiers I shared with you at the outset of this text. Here's what happens with 1 Corinthians 11. We choose up sides, and then we argue our side. Right? I'm a covering guy, so I'm going to argue the text to fit my narrative. I'm an uncovered guy in modern times, and I'm going to argue the text to fit my narrative. And because we do that, and I'm not saying that's really, I'm not trying to accuse people. I'm just saying that's kind of where it ends up. And when we do that, we sometimes can miss clues and thoughts that are really helping us understand that's not really the line of thinking here. What he's saying is, judge yourselves, right? That's how he started this conversation. You guys tell me what you think, right? That's how we might say that. What do you think? Is it really comely? Is it really something that in our culture, Paul says, with our traditions and ordinances, with our behaviors of how we demonstrate respect for these relationships that we're in, is it really comely for a woman to pray unto God? Doesn't even nature tell you that if a man has long hair, you would understand that? You can judge about that, right? That's what he says to Corinth. And the thought doesn't switch. If a woman have long hair, it's a glory to her, for hair is given her for a covering. Can't you all just come to an understanding of what's kind of appropriate and what's not appropriate? Can we just use some common sense here, folks? That's a little bit, I think, what Paul's saying. Can we not just judge yourselves? Can we not just interject some basic common sense here in their culture of what was appropriate and inappropriate, what demonstrated comeliness and what didn't? And he says, just think about it and behave appropriately accordingly. If you're praying and prophesying in the Spirit and you're not evidencing that you respect the relationship you have to man, then that's probably a mistake, Paul says. We need to respect the traditions and the ordinances to demonstrate that appropriately, and probably ought to. So let's just think about it reasonably, Paul says. And I still contend that's why I don't stand before this audience today and tell all the ladies you need to get a head covering on. The reason is because that's not the culture, that's not the conversation today, that's not the situation we're in, that's not what's happening today. The narratives don't fit for the specifics for us. What we learn about this, though, is simply this. Should we all still respect that relationship in order? Absolutely, right? Absolutely. That didn't go away. And the way we might demonstrate that in our culture and world might be vastly different than the way other cultures might demonstrate that respect. And we've got to be careful not to get hung up in this detail and forget there's a bigger context, there's a greater situation in terms of who it's relevant to and why it's relevant to them. And then an ultimate just kind of Paul saying, listen, you all get it. Nature tells you what was intended. And so let's not be what in verse 16? let's not be contentious over this matter. For we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. I'm going to pause here in the room for a minute and thank all those who were joining us from home. We're going to leave a couple of minutes for some last-minute questions and thoughts here in the room. But I do want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. And Lord willing, we'll be back at 10 o'clock Sunday morning for our worship together and our continued study of Paul's letter to Corinth next Wednesday night at 7. God bless.
Holy words long preserved for our walk in this world, they resound with God's.
You have been watching Growing in Faith, a weekly Bible study presented by the Paden City Church of Christ. We invite you to join us again on Monday morning for Drawing